The rain drove sideways, rattling against the heavy nylon of the expedition tent like scattered gravel. I kept my back to the punishing wind, my hands entirely steady as I systematically tightened the guy lines. The storm had rolled over the upper ridge 2 hours ahead of the meteorological projections, catching us entirely exposed on the steep northern face of the incline. I wrapped the thick paracord around a reinforced steel peg, finding the exact right angle against the slick, treacherous slope, and drove it deep into the saturated earth with the heavy, mud-caked heel of my tactical boot. Mud splattered violently against the lower hem of my waterproof jacket and coated the knuckles of my insulated gloves. The heavy fabric was already weighed down significantly by the sudden squall that had trapped us exactly 3 miles short of the designated drop site. The ambient temperature was plummeting fast, the air turning brittle, sharp, and unforgiving in the isolated forest clearing. "The wind is shifting direction again?" Sienna's voice cut through the overwhelming noise of the storm, tight and entirely practical, devoid of the useless panic that usually infected corporate clients in the field. I glanced over my shoulder, swiping a thick line of freezing, muddy water from the sharp angle of my jaw. She was sitting just inside the vestibule of the tent, her knees pulled up tightly to her chest to physically conserve whatever body heat she had left, her posture rigidly upright. She dressed for the warm, deceptive afternoon we had started out with, light canvas hiking trousers and a dark athletic base layer, gear that was completely and utterly outmatched by the sudden 40-degree drop in the mountain temperature. She was shivering, the fine tremors vibrating visibly through her narrow shoulders, though she clamped her jaw shut with sheer willpower to hide the violent chattering of her teeth. She didn't utter a single word of complaint about the miserable, deteriorating conditions. She just tightened her grip on the waterproof map case until her knuckles paled beneath the translucent plastic, meticulously tracking the changing GPS coordinates and elevation markers. "It's an updraft funneling straight up from the lower ravine," I said, my voice raised just enough to carry clearly over the howling wind, keeping my tone entirely measured, flat, and grounded. "It means the localized low-pressure system is effectively locking us in place on this specific ridge. We aren't moving anywhere safely for the next 6 hours. The visibility is absolute zero, and the underlying shale is far too unstable for a descent." I finished securing the final anchor point on the windward side, testing the overall tension with a hard, unforgiving pull. It held perfectly firm against a sudden, incredibly heavy gust that threatened to rip the high-grade nylon right off its reinforced seams. I grabbed my waterproof hard case, the heavy, impact-resistant Black Pelican containing the climate-controlled carbon fiber extraction tubes, the highly specialized tools of my trade, and ducked low into the tent, pulling the heavy industrial zipper shut behind me with a sharp, definitive sound. The sudden drop in wind noise was immediate and stark, leaving only the heavy, oppressive, rhythmic drum of the rain hitting the thin canopy mere inches above our heads. Inside, the tent felt smaller than it had 10 minutes ago. I kept my movements highly deliberate, staying strictly on my designated side of the invisible centerline that divided the small, temporary floor plan. I unclipped my wet, heavy tactical chest rig, setting it carefully beside the hard case, checking the waterproof silicone seals out of pure, ingrained habit. Procedure kept me alive out here. Vanguard's reckless shortcuts killed careers. 6 hours puts us drastically behind the primary projection, Sienna said, tapping a specialized digital stylus against the corner of the GPS unit. She didn't look up at me, her dark, intensely focused eyes fixed entirely on the digital topography glowing harshly on the small, scratched screen. Vanguard Security logged a secondary recovery permit at the lower ranger station this morning. Julian sent the alert text right before we lost the last bar of cell service at the lower elevation. If they have an off-road ATV, they'll bypass the switchbacks entirely. They'll reach the logging cache long before we do. I reached into my waterproof dry bag, bypassing my extra climbing carabiners and heavy static lines, and pulled out a thick, fleece-lined thermal jacket. The dangerous blue tint forming at the edge of her lips was all the physiological data I required to act. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't ask for permission to offer comfort in a crisis. I simply leaned across the small divide of the tent and draped the heavy jacket directly over her shaking shoulders. "Put your arms through the sleeves. You're losing core heat rapidly," I instructed, my tone brooking absolutely no argument. She blinked, clearly startled by the sudden, encompassing weight of the fabric, looking up at me with wide, guarded eyes. "I'm fine, Archer. I don't need." "Your definition of fine is currently registering a highly visible microtremor in your right hand, which means Your fine motor skills will degrade completely by the time we have to handle a fragile, structurally compromised 17th century canvas, I said, keeping my focus entirely on the small, high-altitude camp stove I was systematically unboxing from my pack. Wear the fleece. Sienna, I need your eyes sharp and your hands perfectly steady, not your pride intact. She pressed her lips together into a thin line, a flash of pure, unadulterated annoyance tightening her expression. But she slid her arms into the oversized, insulated sleeves without another word of protest. The dark fabric swallowed her frame entirely, reaching down past her hips. Within seconds, the visible, violent, shivering in her shoulders finally began to subside. She pulled the thick collar up slightly, letting the heavy synthetic insulation do its job against the damp, biting chill of the mountain air. I hope you fully enjoy the five-star accommodations, I said dryly, striking a magnesium flint with a piece of high-carbon steel, catching a bright, aggressive spark on the stove's element. The small, intensely hot blue flame hissed to life, fighting against the damp, heavy air trapped inside the tent. Room service is currently delayed due to weather, but the ambient noise of the storm is entirely complimentary. She let out a short, breathy huff that almost sounded like a genuine laugh, the rigid, defensive tension leaving her neck for just a fraction of a second. I'll be sure to leave a glowing review for the exceptional mud and the distinct lack of proper seating. I charge extra for the authentic wilderness mud, I replied effortlessly, setting a small titanium pot of filtered water directly over the blue flame. I shifted my gaze to watch the digital gauge on the side of my Pelican hardcase, verifying that the internal humidity of the extraction tubes was holding perfectly steady at exactly 50%. She immediately went back to checking her specialized authentication kit, methodically making sure her jeweler's loop, her precision thread counter, and her high-intensity handheld UV lights were absolutely bone-dry. Sienna Reyes didn't miss details. A forged brushstroke 10 feet away wouldn't survive the scrutiny of her halogen lamp. But out here, in the mud, the rain, and the punishing altitude, I was the one who controlled the variables. We shared the exact same objective: recovering the stolen Gilded Horizon before the insurance firm officially paid out the massive $20 million claim to a highly suspicious private collector. Vanguard doesn't have an ATV, I told her, reaching out to adjust the small brass valve on the stove to maximize the heat output against the freezing ambient temperature. I checked the specific trail restrictions before we even left the city limits. Sector 4 is ecologically protected under strict federal jurisdiction. Motorized vehicles carry a mandatory equipment impound and a severe federal offense charge. Marcus might routinely break civil laws and cut procedural corners to get a fast payday, but he won't ever risk a federal ban that permanently revokes his firm's operating license. He's walking up this mountain, exactly like us. You actually checked the local trail ordinance before a tactical recovery? She asked, a perfectly arched brow raised in mild, genuine surprise. I don't lose lucrative contracts to inferior competitors because I forgot to read the local regulations, I said simply, not boasting, just stating an operational fact. The water finally boiled, a low, steady hiss, cutting clearly through the relentless sound of the rain, battering the nylon. I poured the hot water into 2 dented steel mugs, stirring in the dark, bitter instant powder, and handed one across the small divide to her. She took it immediately, wrapping both of her hands tightly around the warm metal, letting the intense heat seep directly into her pale palms. We sat in absolute silence for a very long time, listening to the rain batter the roof of our small sanctuary. I could smell the sharp, clean tang of wet pine needles and atmospheric ozone from the storm raging outside, a stark, wild contrast to the metallic, contained heat of the small stove burning between us. I didn't ask if she was okay. I didn't offer empty platitudes. I simply checked the topographical map, checked the pressure seals on my hard case, and kept the stove flame perfectly steady. By nightfall, the violent storm finally broke, leaving behind a profound, dripping, heavy silence in the woods. The temperature had stabilized into a biting, bone-deep chill, and the darkness was absolute beneath the dense, ancient pine canopy. I was meticulously adjusting the heavy, load-bearing straps of my tactical pack, clipping my high-lumen headlamp into place on my forehead, when a sharp, electronic beep echoed loudly in the small, confined space. Sienna pulled her satellite communicator from the deep pocket of her trousers. The small digital screen glowed a harsh, sickly green in the dim light of the tent. She read the incoming text message, and her face went completely pale, all the color draining from her features in an instant. "What is it?" I asked, snapping a heavy, load-bearing carabiner into place on my chest harness, the metallic click sounding exceptionally loud in the quiet tent. "It's Julian," she said. Her voice was entirely hollow, the polished, professional cadence she usually maintained completely stripped away by shock. The underwriters moved the final deadline. Vanguard sent them a message via Satlink, claiming his team is only 2 miles from the logging cache. The executive board panicked. They just officially authorized Vanguard to take the primary lead on the extraction. They nullified our contract, Archer. Thomas wanted me replaced. Sienna knew it. Vanguard knew it too. It was the culmination of months of corporate maneuvering, utilizing a temporary weather delay to execute a permanent hostile takeover of the assignment. I thumbed the folded contract section in my head, verifying the exact legal parameters, then snapped the waterproof map open like a blade. "They haven't actually nullified anything yet," I said, dropping my voice into the cold, methodical, authoritative register I used when a tactical plan needed to pivot rapidly under extreme pressure. A digital text message from a panicked broker isn't a binding legal injunction. Until Vanguard has a signed transfer and a logged chain of custody, he doesn't have jurisdiction. Physical possession dictates the timeline. She looked up at me, gesturing widely to the pitch-black darkness outside the tent. "It's completely pitch black out there, Archer. The main trail is a washed-out, unstable river of mud. We can't possibly beat his team on the switchbacks." "I don't need to use the main trail," I said, pointing the narrow beam of my red-filtered flashlight directly at the map, tracing a jagged, incredibly tight line of elevation that bypassed the marked, established paths entirely. The switchbacks take 3 hours of steady hiking. This specific ridgeline takes exactly 1 hour. It's a highly aggressive ascent, and it's going to be dangerously slick, but it puts us directly above the bunker cache. "Can we actually do it in the dark?" she asked, her dark eyes searching my face intensely, visibly calculating the severe physical risk of the climb against the absolute professional ruin waiting for her back in the city. "I can," I said, meeting her gaze without wavering. "The only question is if you trust me to guide you." She looked down at the map, tracing the tight, perilous elevation lines with her own eyes, then looked back at me. The ambient glow of her headlamp caught the fierce, unyielding determination rapidly returning to her expression. She leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet, damp tent, but her tone was harder than tempered steel. "We have 1 weekend, Archer. Make it count." We packed up the entire campsite in under 5 minutes flat. I secured the delicate extraction tubes tightly to my external frame pack, double-checking the tension locks, and handed her a secondary high-lumen tactical flashlight. "Step exactly where I step," I instructed her firmly, zipping my waterproof jacket all the way up to my chin to block the wind. "Keep your center of gravity extremely low to the ground. If you feel the earth give way beneath your boots, do not try to stand up, drop to your knees immediately to arrest the slide." The hike up the ridge was absolutely brutal. The steep forest floor was a slick, unstable mess of wet, rotting leaves, loose shale, and deep, treacherous mud that tried to suck the boots right off our feet. Every single step required constant, meticulous calibration. I moved with deliberate, practiced focus, testing the integrity of the ground with my heavy boots before placing my full weight on it, then turning back every few yards to illuminate the safe path for Sienna. The freezing wind whipped through the ancient trees, biting sharply at any exposed skin on our faces and hands. The incline grew steeper with every 100 yards, forcing us to use exposed roots as handholds, pulling our own body weight up the side of the mountain. Halfway up the grueling incline, we hit a massive washout, a 5-foot section of the narrow trail that had simply succumbed to the rain and slid away into a sheer, 40-foot drop down the dark ravine. The sound of rushing, violent water echoed menacingly from the absolute darkness below. The structural integrity of the remaining ledge was highly questionable at best. I stopped immediately, analyzing the gaping gap, my mind instantly calculating tension vectors and load-bearing anchor points based on the surrounding, deeply rooted timber. "Wait exactly here," I commanded. I pulled a 20-foot length of heavy-duty, static climbing rope from the side pouch of my pack. I secured one end tightly around a thick, incredibly deep-rooted pine tree, tying a flawless, textbook figure-8 follow-through knot. I crossed the treacherous washout first, finding the small, solid footholds hidden beneath the slick mud, then braced myself securely on the other side of the gap. I wrapped the free end of the static rope twice around my waist and locked my stance, dropping my center of weight and digging the heavy, reinforced heels of my boots deeply into a thick network of exposed roots to create an immovable human anchor. Keep constant tension on the line, I told her, my voice cutting cleanly and authoritatively through the dark, rushing noise of the wind and water. Do not look down at the ravine. Look directly at my chest. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement. She grasped the thick rope, her knuckles turning bone-white in the harsh, focused beam of her headlamp. She stepped out over the terrifying void, planting her boot cautiously into the mud on the edge. On her second step, the loose shale shifted dramatically underneath her weight. She slipped instantly, dropping a few terrifying inches with a sharp, involuntary gasp, her boots scrambling desperately against the loose, crumbling earth. I didn't panic. I didn't even flinch. The sudden, heavy weight hit the static line with a sharp, violent jerk. The thick nylon bit deeply and painfully into my waist, but I immediately locked my knees and hauled aggressively back on the rope, pulling the line incredibly taut so she wouldn't fall a single inch further, absorbing her entire body weight effortlessly into my grounded stance. I've got you, I said evenly, offering absolutely no pity, just absolute, unshakable stability. You are completely secure. The large rock 2 inches to your left is solid granite. Find it. She took a sharp, ragged breath, steadied herself against the unyielding, iron-like tension of my line, and found the solid foothold. When she finally reached my side of the washout, she was breathing incredibly hard, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline spike as she finally let go of the rope. I released the tension slowly, stepping back to give her necessary space to recover. She didn't ask for a break. She didn't complain about the thick mud coating her trousers or the freezing air violently burning her lungs. She simply wiped a streak of wet earth from her pale cheek, adjusted her tight grip on her flashlight, and nodded determinedly up at the dark tree line. An hour and 40 agonizing minutes later, our muscles burning with accumulated lactic acid, we finally crested the top of the ridge. Below us, completely nestled in a dark hollow of massive old-growth pines, was a dilapidated, moss-covered concrete structure built directly into the side of the hill. The logging cache, lights out, I murmured, instantly switching off my headlamp beam. Sienna did the exact same without a moment's hesitation. Through the dense trees, far down the lower, marked path, a faint, erratic halogen light moved steadily upward. Vanguard's team, they were less than 20 minutes away from the bunker, moving much faster on the established switchbacks than they could have through the dense brush we had navigated. Move, I said. We descended the steep slope as quickly as safety allowed, using the thick, ancient trunks of the trees for visual cover. The cache was essentially a heavy, reinforced concrete and steel bunker, mostly swallowed by decades of forest overgrowth. The heavy iron door was badly rusted around the hinges, the metal flaking away in jagged strips, but it was currently secured with a massive, heavy modern padlock that looked entirely out of place against the rotting wood frame. Sienna approached the heavy door, shining a small, discreet red-filtered light directly on the lock mechanism. It's a high-grade boron carbide shackle. We can't possibly pick this without a specialized, motorized rig. It's specifically designed to completely withstand industrial bolt cutters. I don't need to pick it, I said flatly. I pulled a compact, incredibly high-torque battery-operated angle grinder from the main compartment of my pack. It wasn't an elegant solution, but it was exactly the tool required for a brute-force tactical extraction when the clock had entirely run out. Cover your eyes and step back. I hit the power switch. The high-pitched, screaming whine of the grinder instantly shattered the absolute silence of the deep woods, sparks flying in a brilliant, blinding, aggressive arc as the diamond-tipped blade bit viciously into the hardened shackle. The torque kicked hard against my wrists, attempting to twist out of my grip, but I held the angle perfectly steady, reading the microscopic vibration of the tool to ensure the blade didn't bind and cause a dangerous kickback. The acrid smell of ozone and burning, superheated metal filled the damp, cold air. Exactly 30 seconds later, the hardened lock gave way with a heavy, satisfying clank, dropping into the thick mud at our feet. I pulled the heavy iron door open, the rusted hinges screaming in loud protest. The stale air inside smelled strongly of dry dust, encroaching mildew, and century-old timber suddenly escaping into the night. I stepped inside the structure, sweeping the small, concrete room with my tactical light. The walls were bare concrete, streaked with years of condensation. In the dead center of the room, Sitting incongruously on a rotting wooden crate was a long, cylindrical PVC pipe wrapped entirely in heavy-duty silver duct tape. "The smuggler's casing," Sienna whispered, stepping cautiously into the room right behind me. "Check it," I said, stepping back into the shadows near the doorway to give her the floor. This was entirely her domain. She pulled a pair of blue nitrile gloves from her pocket and snapped them onto her hands, the latex sound unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. With incredibly precise, careful movements, she used a small, razor-sharp utility knife to cut through the layers of tape, slicing away the adhesive barrier, and slowly slid the tight plastic cap off the pipe. Reaching inside with utmost care, she extracted a thick, protective roll of archival glassine paper. She unrolled it just enough on the top of the crate to expose the top right corner of the hidden canvas. She pulled a specialized 40x jeweler's loop from her pocket and clicked on a powerful handheld UV light, hovering it meticulously over the exposed, ancient paint. The silence in the bunker stretched, heavy with consequence. I stopped breathing for a beat, planting my boots firmly into the concrete floor so my beam didn't cast a single distracting shadow over her workspace. I watched the intense focus on her face, the way her eyes scanned the microscopic landscape of the oil paint, searching for the telltale signs of forgery that had fooled countless other experts. "Look right here," she murmured, pointing to a tiny, almost invisible section of the canvas under the vibrant purple glow. The craquelier pattern, the microscopic, spiderweb-age cracks in the paint layer matches the 17th century atmospheric tension parameters perfectly. The lead-white pigment density is entirely consistent with the artist's known palette. She leaned closer, her nose mere inches from the surface of the canvas, her breathing shallow and controlled. More importantly, the top layer of varnish shows the exact correct oxidized green fluorescence under the UV spectrum. Modern synthetic varnish glows a bright, undeniable blue. This is absolutely authentic. It's the gilded horizon. "Good," I said, the heavy tension in my chest releasing slightly. "Now we lock it down for transport." I opened my hard case, pulling out the highly specialized, climate-controlled carbon fiber cylinder. I checked the internal digital humidity gauge one final time, still perfectly calibrated to exactly 50% to prevent the fragile canvas from experiencing sudden atmospheric shock during the descent. "Slide it in." She carefully, reverently transferred the rolled canvas directly into my cylinder. I sealed the heavy end cap, hearing the distinct, reassuring hiss of the vacuum pressure lock engaging, securing the microclimate. I pulled a stack of pre-printed, holographic tamper-evident labels from the lid of my hard case, along with a heavy, waterproof archival logbook. There were no fragile electronics involved in this step that could fail in the damp environment, just permanent archival ink and registered serial numbers. I snapped a high-resolution photo of the sealed tube resting securely in her gloved hands, ensuring the exact time, date, and pinpoint GPS coordinates were permanently burning into the unalterable metadata of my chest rig's time-stamped documentation unit. I signed the heavy adhesive label with the archival pen, my signature a jagged scrawl, then handed the pen directly to her. She signed her name cleanly, right beneath mine, the black ink, legally and permanently binding both of us to the recovery. I slapped the label securely across the pressure seal, dropped the entire tube into the heavy plastic evidence bag, and locked it tight with a numbered, unbreakable zip tie. The transaction was definitively complete. By every metric of international recovery standards, the painting was now undeniably, legally in our firm's custody. Heavy, unbothered footsteps splashed loudly in the mud outside, followed immediately by the sweeping, blinding glare of a bright halogen beam cutting sharply through the open doorway of the bunker. Well, a voice drawled, dripping with false amusement. Marcus Vanguard stepped casually into the bunker, flanked by two incredibly large men wearing unmarked tactical gear. Marcus wore a smug, easy smile, holding a heavy set of industrial bolt cutters resting effortlessly on his shoulder. "Looks like I'm a little bit late to the party, or maybe I'm just in time to take all the heavy lifting off your hands, Parker." I stepped squarely in front of Sienna, placing my body entirely between her and Vanguard, creating a physical barrier. I didn't reach for a weapon. I didn't raise my voice. I simply held up the signed archival logbook in my left hand and the sealed, labeled evidence bag in the right, keeping my physical stance deeply rooted to the concrete floor. "You're late, Marcus," I said, my voice dead calm, completely devoid of any intimidation or fear. "Chain of custody has been formally established, time-stamped, geolocated, and signed by an authorized, licensed authenticator. This item is now the explicit legal property of my firm, acting directly under contract with the underwriters. Marcus's smug smile faded slightly around the edges. He looked at the sealed bag, noting the shining holographic seals reflecting his halogen light, then glared at me. One of his massive men took a threatening half-step forward, his right hand dropping casually to a heavy maglite hanging at his tactical belt. I shifted my weight slightly, perfectly centering my gravity, fully ready to execute a physical block, but I kept the logbook raised in plain sight. Marcus tried to step to the side to address Sienna directly, but I effortlessly mirrored his movement, blocking his line of sight to her without a moment's hesitation. The executive board nullified your contract exactly 2 hours ago. I have the direct authorization to take possession of the asset, Marcus said, his tone hardening into a blatant threat. A text message from a panicked insurance broker isn't a legal injunction, I countered smoothly, offering him absolutely nothing but a massive, unyielding bureaucratic wall. Until you have a signed transfer and a logged chain of custody, you don't have jurisdiction. Physical possession dictates the timeline. If you touch this bag, you are stealing a documented interstate shipment, and I have the time-stamped recording rolling right now to prove your intent. I tapped the small, blinking lens, securely mounted on my tactical vest. Marcus's jaw tightened dangerously. He knew the procedural parameters perfectly well. He operated deeply in the gray areas, cutting massive corners to maximize his profit margins. But he wouldn't ever risk his firm's lucrative license for a single payout. He glared at me with pure hatred, then looked past my shoulder at Sienna. "You're making a massive mistake, Reyes," Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with ugly condescension. "Your boss, Thomas, specifically wanted me on this job. When we get back to the city, you're going to have a hell of a lot of explaining to do. You're backing the wrong horse, and it's going to end your career." I didn't let her take the verbal hit. "Miss Reyes executed her professional duty with absolute, flawless precision," I said, my tone turning ice cold, making sure my voice filled every corner of the small concrete room so his hired men heard every single word of his defeat. "If your board has a problem with the outcome, they can take it up with my legal team on Monday morning. Now, clear the doorway. We are leaving." Marcus stared at me for a long, incredibly tense moment, weighing the violence against the legal consequences. Finally, he scoffed loudly in disgust, dropping the heavy bolt cutters to his side and waving his men back out into the freezing rain. "Enjoy the long walk down." "Parker." I turned slightly, keeping my body angled securely toward the threat, and gestured for Sienna to exit first. She stepped out into the dark forest, her chin held incredibly high, completely and utterly unfazed by his blatant intimidation tactics. "0 stars for the local security company," Sienna muttered quietly but clearly as she passed directly by Vanguard, absolutely refusing to look at him. I almost smiled. "I told you, I charge extra for the mud." I followed her out into the storm, keeping the heavy, hard case tightly gripped in my hand, watching our backs meticulously until we were completely swallowed by the dense trees and the darkness of the descent. The hike back down to the trailhead took 3 grueling hours. The descent was much quieter, the massive spike of adrenaline slowly leaving our systems, replaced entirely by the mechanical, exhausting rhythm of simply putting one foot in front of the other. We finally reached my parked truck just as the first gray, anemic light of dawn was breaking over the distant tree line. I unlocked the heavy doors and placed the hard case directly into the reinforced steel lockbox bolted in the back, spinning the combination dial rapidly to secure it. When I turned around, Sienna was standing silently by the passenger door. She looked utterly exhausted, her dark hair damp and plastered to her neck, heavy mud caked entirely up to her knees on her boots. "You planned for him to show up?" she said quietly, leaning her tired back against the cold metal of the truck. "I planned for the absolute worst-case scenario," I corrected, slamming the lockbox shut with a definitive thud. "I secured the resource entirely legally. The paperwork is completely airtight. Vanguard can't touch your reputation now." She looked down at her muddy hands, then back up to meet my eyes directly. "Thank you for what you said in there to him." "I merely spoke the facts," I said, pulling my keys from my pocket and unlocking the passenger door for her. She stepped heavily up into the cab of the truck. "We should get back to the city. The board meets at exactly 9 a.m. on Tuesday." "Right," I said, walking around to the driver's side. I started the powerful engine, immediately blasting the internal heater until the dashboard vents rattled. She didn't speak on the long drive back to civilization, just stared blankly out the rain-streaked passenger window, watching the wilderness give way to paved roads. But the rigid, defensive line of her shoulders had finally dropped. She reached out slowly and placed her hand near the vent, letting the dry, artificial heat thaw her freezing fingers. That was Sunday morning. Now, it was Tuesday morning, and the atmosphere in the corporate headquarters was utterly suffocating. I stood in the pristine, brightly lit hallway outside the main executive conference room, adjusting the stiff cuffs of my dark suit. The heavy, imposing oak doors were firmly closed. Julian, the insurance broker who had sent the cowardly panic text on Saturday night, paced the thick, carpeted floor nervously next to me. He checked his expensive silver watch for the third time in 2 minutes, sweat visibly beading on his forehead despite the aggressive corporate air conditioning. "Thomas is absolutely furious about the Vanguard situation," Julian muttered, keeping his voice incredibly low and frantic. "They wanted a quiet, simple, frictionless payout recovery, and you turned it into a massive jurisdictional dispute. The underwriters are actively looking for a convenient scapegoat to present to the shareholders." I tried to warn Sienna to distance herself. "She's going to take the heat for letting you keep the primary lead." I stopped adjusting my cuffs. I turned to Julian, my expression flattening into a cold, terrifyingly hard line. I absolutely despised men who panicked when the rules required actual backbone. "Sienna Reyes personally secured a $20 million asset for your firm under brutal conditions that would have broken your preferred corporate contractor in half," I said, my voice quiet but sharp enough to make Julian stop his pacing immediately. "She didn't let me keep the lead. She executed a master-level authentication in a freezing, wet bunker because she knows her job far better than anyone sitting at that mahogany table. Our counsel already has the compliance packet compiled. If you try to scapegoat her, my attorney will file the compliance packet today." Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting fearfully to the closed doors. He didn't say another word. 5 minutes later, we were officially called in. I took my seat in the sleek, glass-walled conference room. Across the massive, polished mahogany table sat the intimidating panel of 3 senior underwriters and Thomas, Sienna's aggressively ambitious boss. Sienna sat exactly 2 chairs away from me. She wore a sharp, impeccably tailored navy suit, her hair perfectly styled, every single trace of the muddy, exhausted woman from the woods completely erased. She stared fixedly at the legal notepad in front of her, the picture of corporate stoicism. "The timeline of this extraction is highly irregular, Mr. Parker," Thomas said immediately, steepling his fingers, his tone heavily laced with corporate arrogance. "Vanguard claims you directly circumvented their authorized approach. Sienna, your authorization of Parker was a critical, unacceptable error in judgment. I'm officially pulling your authentication license effective immediately." I sat forward, the movement slow and deliberate. I opened my leather folio and dropped a thick, perfectly bound stack of printed documents directly onto the exact center of the mahogany table. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Our counsel already has the complete compliance packet," I said calmly, pointing firmly to the stack of documents. "If you pull her license, it goes directly to the regulators today. I suggest you read the specific timestamps on page 2. One underwriter set his silver pen down on the glass and didn't pick it back up. Thomas swallowed once, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his stiff collar, then turned the heavy, premium-grade paper like it weighed 50 pounds. His eyes darted rapidly from the archival signatures on my logbook to Vanguard's conflicting, completely pathetic email printout. No one spoke. The soft morning rain tapped gently against the thick corporate glass, a faint, distant echo of the violent storm we had survived together. The senior underwriters exchanged a heavy, panicked look among themselves. Thomas realized with a sickening clarity that he had absolutely no leverage left to use against her. "Well," Thomas said, clearing his throat awkwardly, his tone rapidly shifting from aggressive accusatory to desperately accommodating. "It appears the paperwork is entirely in order. The recovery is officially closed without incident." "Excellent work, Sienna." Sienna looked up, her gaze meeting mine directly across the expanse of the table. She closed her notepad with a definitive snap and stood up, looking directly at the senior board, completely refusing to play small ever again. "I cannot take the sole credit for this success. Mr. Parker's tactical execution is what ultimately saved the asset from ruin. Going forward, I will be formally requesting that his firm be listed as our exclusive primary contractor on all high-risk recoveries. It was a massive, industry-shifting professional endorsement. She was putting her newly secured, untouchable reputation entirely behind me and my firm. Thomas looked profoundly surprised, completely outmaneuvered, but nodded slowly in defeat. Noted. Sienna. We will draft the new vendor terms this afternoon. The meeting adjourned abruptly. The executives filed quickly out of the room, leaving just Sienna and me standing quietly by the large windows overlooking the sprawling, rain-washed city below. I picked up my folio, sliding the remaining papers safely inside. A primary contractor endorsement? That's a very bold move, Reyes. She turned to face me, the soft morning light catching the warmth returning to her dark eyes. I only back the things I know are completely authentic. She reached into her blazer pocket and slid a newly minted, hard plastic security badge across the glass table. My name was printed sharply right under hers, granting full, unrestricted access to her firm's vast archives. She picked up her ceramic coffee mug from the table, wrapping both hands tightly around it just like she had in the freezing tent. Friday, she said, tapping the shiny badge with her index finger, her tone shifting from professional to incredibly warm. And you're not pitching it to me as business again. I looked down at the badge, the physical proof of her trust, then looked back up at her, pocketing the plastic card securely. Friday, I agreed. The end. Closing thoughts? You don't earn trust by talking. You earn it by holding the line when the pressure spikes. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.